So, power posing research is a really great example of the scientific method at work. No theory is built on just one finding. Uh, uh, any Before any finding becomes a theory, it has to be shown over and over and again that it's a robust finding. And sometimes a cool finding in one study can be refuted by another study. Multiple sources of evidence are needed, and nothing ever really becomes fact. In psychology, we just look at everything as this is our best guess about how the world works or about how psychological phenomena work. So very briefly, we're going to go through the steps of the scientific method. Many of you have probably seen this in other courses. First, the first step in the scientific method is the theory. Um, and a theory is a well-developed set of ideas that propose an explanation for observed phenomena. In the power posing research, Dr. Cuddy's theory was that power posing can influence how confident you feel, as well as later retracted, your body's physiological response. And a theory is different than a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a tentative and testable statement about the relationship between two or more variables. Another way of saying it is that a theory is something that has a large existing set of data to support it. There's already been plenty of data collected on a particular topic, and together that data helps inform a theory. A hypothesis is a specific application of a theory in which we are predicting, or it's an assumption about the direction a particular set of data will go. You make a hypothesis before you make an experiment. You make a hypothesis as an assumption or a prediction of how the experiment itself will go, whereas a theory is built upon multiple experiments. Um, Another thing about hypotheses is that they can be formulated through direct observation of the real world, and they can also be formulated through a careful review of previous scientific literature, what we call a literature review. So in Dr. Cuddy's study, it was really a direct observation of the real world that led her to form a hypothesis. So she noticed that female students in her graduate business courses often displayed low confidence in class and tended to show more constricted and closed body language in comparison to their male counterparts. And her direct observation led her to make this hypothesis that people who adopt more high power poses will feel more confident than people who adopt low power poses. Another aspect of the scientific method is that a scientific hypothesis needs to be falsifiable. It needs to be capable of being shown that is incorrect. And so we touched on this in the very first lecture about the influence that Sigmund Freud has on the field of psychology, and a major reason for why most modern psychologists don't rely on Sigmund Freud's research that much today is because a lot of his ideas aren't falsifiable. They're great ideas, but they can't be directly tested. For example, he had these conceptions about the different structures that make up the unconscious mind, and it's very difficult to conduct an empirical study to prove or disprove the difference between, say, the ego and the superego. And we'll talk about his concepts a little bit later in a later chapter. So the next step in the scientific method is to form an experiment where an investigator actively manipulates one or more variables to observe their effect on one or more other variables, while holding any other variables or any other factors constant, or controlling them or eliminating them. So in the power posing research study, what was manipulated was the type of power poses, that you were either doing a high power pose or a low power pose, and everything else was controlled. They were given saliva sample. They had to give saliva samples at similar points in time. They had to hold the poses for the same amount of time. They had to complete the same gambling task. The experiment was specified so that the only thing that's different between the two groups is the type of power pose. And then the next step is to analyze the data to perform some kind of statistical analysis. Oftentimes, when we hear about research on the news or when you just are casually looking about your world, you might see differences between groups. But statistical analysis is a way of seeing is any difference that we detect or any pattern of data that we see, is it due to chance or is it due to some real difference related to the manipulation of the experiment. And so one common metric for determining is it due to chance or is it due to some real manipulation is the p-value, or we'll just call it for the sake of simplicity, the probability value. The common acceptable criterion is that we are okay with less than 5% of the experimental results being due to chance. We want to have 95 percent confidence that the results of our experiment are due to the actual manipulation that was performed by the investigator. And so you'll commonly hear of this metric, a p-value of less than zero point zero 0.05, which says that we are 95% sure that this is not due to chance. And in Dr. Cuddy's original study, they reported a p-value of less than zero point zero 0.05 for the testosterone changes and a p-value of less than zero point zero 0.02 for the cortisol changes. So they are 98% sure that those differences were not due to chance. But that doesn't all necessarily mean that those differences will hold in future studies, particularly as you make the sample size bigger or as you make the study more rigorous and alter aspects of the study to make the differences more clear. And so lastly, in the scientific method, you have to summarize your data and report the findings and examine whether or not the findings confirm your previous theory or if they modify your theory, if they support your hypothesis or if they do not support your hypothesis. And so in Dr. Cuddy's research, initially the findings supported her original hypothesis, but later on in the process, as many other researchers took the mantle and did similar studies, they had to revise the overall theory, and they didn't support the hypothesis that uh, physiological changes could occur as a result of high power posing. And so you'll be discussing the scientific method a little bit more in lab, in the upcoming lab for week 2, where you'll be walking through some examples of scientific studies in psychology.